Welcome back to another video where we're going to have a look at relationships in Prisma. This video is going to be beginner friendly, so if you're not familiar with SQL or Prisma or database relationships, that's okay, you're still going to be able to find this useful. However, if you are familiar with Prisma, there's going to be a few things in here that you're also going to find useful. There'll be timestamps in the description below, so if you want to refer back to any type of relationship when you're working with your application, you can skip ahead to those parts. So the relationships that we're going to build are going to start off easy and slowly get a little bit more complicated. So we're going to start off with a one-to-one relationship. So this is going to be a user that has one profile and a profile belongs to one user. Then we're going to move on to a one-to-many relationship. So an order can have one user and a user can have many orders. And then we're going to move on to many-to-many relationships. So a product can have multiple categories and a category can belong to multiple products. Then we're going to have a many-to-many relationship where the item references itself. So a category can have a parent category and a parent category can have multiple children. There's two different ways to model many-to-many relationships. Explicit many-to-many, this is where we create a join table manually, which is part of our schema. And this is going to give us a little bit more control. And then we'll have implicit many-to-many relationships, which is what we're going to be modeling in this tutorial. And this is where we're going to let Prisma define the join table. So let's start off by modeling a one-to-one relationship. So I'm going to be using SQLite here, but this is all going to work with any other database. So the first model I want to create is my user. So we say model, user, and then my user is going to have an ID, which is going to be a string, and then this is going to default to a CUID. Next, I want to add my created at, and I also want to add my updated at. So when we create an instance of this user, we're going to default the created at to whatever now returns. And then when we update that object, we're going to update this updated at property here. So now I need to create my profile model. So I'm going to say model profile. And on our profile, we're just going to have an ID, which is also going to be a string. And then this is also going to default to a CUID. Next, we're going to have a name, and this is going to be a string. And we can also have other properties such as email. But I'm just going to leave this as name for now. Next, I want to set my created at and my updated at. Okay, so now comes the fun part where we join these two items together. For my profile, I'm going to have a user, and then this is going to reference our user. Then I'm going to say at relation. And my field that it's going to reference is my user ID. So I'm going to put my user ID down here. I'm going to say this is a string and it has to be unique. So now Prisma is complaining because we don't reference our profile on our user here. So we can fix this by saying profile is of type profile and profile has to be optional. So if we remove this, Prisma will complain here and it says error passing attribute relationship. The relation field profile on model user is required. This is no longer valid because it's not possible to enforce this constraint on the database level. Please change the field of type profile to profile optional to fix this. So we need to make profile optional. So this field here, user with at relation, this is not actually added to our database schema. This is just used to generate types. User ID, on the other hand, is added to our database schema, and I can prove this. So if we open up the terminal, and we say npx prisma migrate dev. Now, if we have a look in our migrations and we open this one up here, you can see that on our profile, we reference a foreign key of user ID, but you can't see a property on here called user. So let's have a look at our first challenge here. We want to create a user that has one profile and a profile that belongs to one user. So I'm going to come over to my code here and we can see we're going to create a one-to-one relationship. So I'm going to say async function create user with profile. Now there's two different ways we can do this. One is going to be a little bit more difficult and then one is going to be very easy. I'm going to show you both ways because it depends on what you're doing as to how you're going to do this. So the first way, we're going to create a user, then we're going to create a profile. And then in the second way, we're going to create a user with a profile. Let's say const user is equal to await prisma.user.create, and we're going to set some data. The data is just going to be empty for now because we don't actually have any data we can set on our user. Next, we want to create a profile. So I'm going to say const profile, and this is going to be await prisma.profile.create. We want to set some data on here, and we want to set a name. I'm just going to use faker.name.firstname. And Prisma is complaining here because we need to set a user. Let's say user ID, and this user ID is going to be equal to user.id. So to create a profile, we have to have a user to set on that profile. And that is because we've said that user ID is going to be unique, and this means that we have an index on user ID on our profile. So now we can return prisma.user.findUnique, and we want to find where the ID is equal to our user ID. And that's console.log 1-to-1 and console.log await create user with profile. And up here, I have this clean function that I'm going to run. So clean. And if we have a look at what clean does, it's just going to delete all of these objects out of profile and out of user. So we're working with a fresh database every time we run this function. So let's run this with yarn1. And you can see here, we found a user with its ID and with the created and updated updates. But you'll notice that we don't have a profile on here. So now we want to say include, and we want to include the profile, and that's going to be true. Let's save that, run this again. And now we have our profile included on the user object. Let's say, for example, we just wanted to get the name out of the user profile. So we could do that by, instead of saying true, we say select name is equal to true. Now let's run this again. And now we get our profile with just our name. Let's say we also want to have our ID. We can set this to true. And we also get our ID and our name. Okay, so let's create our user and our profile all in one go. So let's say const user1 is equal to await. Now we can return an object down here, return, so we can see what both of these results return. And I'll say const user2 is equal to await Prisma user create. We're going to set our data and we want to have a profile. In our profile, we want to use this create keyword here. Now let's return user2. You can see user2 has an ID and we're assuming it has a profile, but we don't know. So now we can add an include clause to our object here. And we want to say profile and we want to select the ID, we want to select the name, and then we can close off these brackets here. Let's run this again. And you can see that we get two objects that are the same. And this one here is just a little bit simpler. Let's have a look at what we did. So we created a user, we created a profile, and then we found our user and included our profile. And then in the second example, we created our user, but we also created our profile as we created our user. So let's have a look at our second challenge here. And this is to create a one-to-many relationship. So an order has one user and a user can have many orders. Let's go back to our schema and we need to model out our order. I'm going to say model order. So an order is going to have an ID, which is going to be a string of type ID. Of course, we're going to have our created at and updated at. We're not going to have any products on our order yet. That's going to be a future challenge. So the next thing we want to do is to model out our user. So we're going to say user, and then we're going to reference our user model here. And we're going to say at relation, And the fields that we're going to reference is going to be a user ID. So we need to add our user ID, and this is going to be of type string. Then we're going to reference the ID. An ID here means that we're going to reference this field here on user. So if we change this to something like user ID, we would need to change our reference down here to user ID. So saving that has added the order for me, and I just want to change that to a lowercase order. The reason that saved that for me is because I come into my VS Code settings here. You can see that I have Prisma and I have editor.formatter on save set to true, but I have my default formatter set to prisma.prisma, and you get this when you install the Prisma extension in VS Code. So let's have a look at this again. So we have our user here, and again, this line here is not added to our migration. It's not stored in our database at all. However, a user ID is stored in our database. This field here is just for types. And if we go back up to our user, we have an array of orders on our user model. And this is also not stored in our database. If we run a migration now, you'll see that user has no reference to order. So let's do a npx prisma migrate dev. I'm going to call this order. And you can see that all this migration does is create a table called order. And even though we changed our user model, it didn't actually change anything on the user model. And that's because the only field we added does not change the actual data in the database. It's only used for types. So let's go have a look at how we're going to work with our one-to-many relationship. So you can see here an order has one user and a user has many orders. So I'm going to create an async function, create order. I'm going to run await clean. Then I'm going to use some helpers here. So I have this create products with categories helper here. And if we have a look at this, this is just going to create a bunch of products with categories. We also have this helper here to create users. However, my create products with categories isn't actually going to work yet. So let's go quickly add a category model so we can get this helper to work. You can say model, category. A category is going to have an ID, a name, created at, and updated fields. Let's run this migration. So we also need to create a product model. So let's do that as well. Model, product. So our product model is going to have an ID, a name. It's going to reference some categories, and this is going to be a many-to-many relationship. So I'm going to save that. And the many-to-many relationship is going to be a product, which references an array of products. Let's run this migration. And our product here also needs to have a description. So let's add that name description, which is going to be a string. So you can see in Prisma how your models start quickly depending on each other, and working with these relationships becomes very important. And we also have a price on our product, and this is just going to be an int. Let's run this. So now we can use these helpers here. So I'm going to say const products is equal to await create products with categories, and const user is equal to create user. Okay, so now we can create an order and connect a user. So I'm going to say const order is equal to await prisma.order.create. I want to set my data here. I want to set my user, and I want to connect my user because remember, we already have a user created here. I want to connect my user where the user ID is equal to user.id. I also want to connect some products here. So I'm just going to connect 3 products. So TypeScript is complaining here, and this is because we do not connect our user by user ID. We're just going to connect it where the ID is equal to user ID. And that's because we're doing a lookup here, and then we're going to find that user, and then we're going to connect it. So TypeScript is complaining because we haven't specified that our order model here actually has products. So let's go back to order and say On order, we have products, and this is going to reference an array of products. Now we need to go down to product, and we need to say order is going to reference an array of orders. So this is going to be a many-to-many relationship because a product can belong to many orders and an order can have many products. So let's run this migration as well. And if we come back, TypeScript is no longer complaining. Okay, so this is how we're going to create an order with many products that is connected to a single user. Let's return, and I want to return my order. So let's console.log, and I want to console.log one-to-many. I want to console log, and I want to create an order with a user. Run this. And you can see here we have our order, and we have our order with an ID and a user ID. So let's have a look at our next challenge here. A product can have multiple categories, and a category can belong to multiple products. If we go back to our schema here, you can see that we actually have a one-to-many relationship here for products and categories. So if we go over to our category, you can see that a category can belong to multiple products, but a product can only have one category. We need to fix this. So the easy way to fix this is to remove this here and add an array bracket. And now we're saying that a category can have multiple products and a product can belong to multiple categories. Let's run this migration, npx prisma migrate dev. I'm going to say yes. Now let's go see how we're going to work with this data. So you can see our challenge. A product can have multiple categories and a category can belong to multiple products. So I'm going to say async function create product with categories. So the first thing I want to do is to create my categories. So I'm going to say const categories is equal to await Prisma transaction. So I actually don't want to do this yet. I just want to create a bunch of promises that I can then throw into a transaction. So I'm going to say categories promises, and then I'm going to say array, and I'm going to create an array with a size of 10. I'm going to fill that with a bunch of nulls. Then I'm going to map over that. And I want to return prisma.category.create. I want to set my data. And I want to set a name here. Let's go have a look at our category. And our category just has a name, so that's good enough. Okay, so now we have a bunch of promises. We want to make sure that we create all of these categories. So we're going to wrap this in Prisma transaction. And what this is going to do is it means if one of these promises fails, it's going to back out of all of the promises. So we don't just create one category, we're actually going to be guaranteed to create 0 or 10 categories. Transactions are a really powerful concept. Let's say you're working with a banking application and you wanted to credit one account and debit another account. You wouldn't want one of those updates to fail. Let's say you credited an account, but the debiting of the account failed, then your banking system is going to be out of whack. You'd want to put both of those queries into a transaction. So if one failed, they both failed. So let's do the same thing for products. So I'm going to say products promises is an array 10.fill null.map. And I'm going to return prisma.product.create. And I'm going to set some data. I'm going to have a name. I'm just going to use faker again. I'm going to have a description. I'm going to use faker. I'm going to set a price. They're all just going to have this price of 100. Now we want to add our categories. And in categories, we're going to use our connect keyword again. And I just want to connect a random category. So this needs to be category. So I'm going to connect, and I'm just going to pick a random number out of our categories here. So this is going to say, get me a random item out of our categories from here, and then set that as the category for this product. Okay, so let's now create our products in a transaction, just like we did with our categories. So let's run this. So console.log many-to-many, and I'm going to run console.log create products with categories, and I'm just going to wrap this in JSON.stringify as well. So yarn 3. Let's have a look at our output here. So you can see that we have an array of products, but we don't have any categories listed on there. So let's go fix that. So when we create our product, we're going to have our data and then want to include category. And I'm going to set this to true. Let's try this again. Okay, so you can see that we have for each product, and then we have an array of categories. I know what you're thinking. Our products only have one category here, but a product can have many categories. How would you do that? So instead of having an object here, you would say this is an array. So we just need to wrap this in array brackets here. And now we can add multiple of these objects here. So let's try run this. And you can see that each product now has multiple categories. So let's have a look at our last challenge here. A category can have a parent category, and a parent category can have multiple children. So let's go over to our schema and model this out. So inside of our category, I'm going to say parent, and a parent is going to be a category. So this is going to reference itself. And then we need to name the reference here. And then we're going to say the field is going to be parent ID. So remember, we need to add this parent ID. So let's do that now. It's going to be a string, and then it's going to reference the ID, which happens to be this category's ID. So now we need to add the other side of this relationship. So we need to say children, and children is going to be an array of categories, and it needs to be a relation, and then we're going to name that relation here. So let's run npx prisma migrate dev. And I'm going to call this category parent. And let's go have a look at the migration file that this created. So we're going to create a new table here called new category, but don't get confused by this. So this is going to drop the original category table, and then we're going to alter the new category table and rename it back to category. But you can see here that we have a constraint for category parent ID, which is a foreign key to the parent ID here. And it's going to reference the category table's ID. So let's go have a look at how we're going to work with this data. So I need to create multiple categories. So I'm going to come back to our last challenge here, and I'm just going to copy this code here because this created our categories. So I'm going to say function create categories. And I'm going to paste this in. So this needs to be an async function. We need to spell create correctly. And again, this is going to create a bunch of random categories for us, and we're going to use a transaction. You don't have to use a transaction for this, but Prisma makes it so easy that you may as well. Okay, so now I want to create my child categories. So I'm going to say const child category promises. Again, we're just going to create 10 here for an example, .fill, and then we're going to map. So I want to return prisma.category.create. And I want to set some data here. And I want to set a name. Again, we're just going to use faker. And then inside of data, we can set our parent. And we want to connect. And I want to connect the ID where the parents, where the category, sorry. And I just want to get an index here. So I'm going to say underscore an index with index and then ID. Okay, so now let's create this in a transaction. And I'm going to console.log many to many and console.log, again, JSON.stringify, create categories. And then we're going to do this with a spacing of 2. Let's run yarn 4. So you can see here that we created a bunch of categories here. Let's go have a look at what this data actually looks like. So I'm going to run npx prisma studio. I'm going to go into categories here, and you can see that we have 20 categories, and half of them have no parent ID. So these are going to be the parent categories. and then the other half have a parent category here. And then the parent categories here, you can see have 1 children. We can select multiple children here. And now you can see this category here has multiple children categories. If you want to know how to format a parent and child relationship, I do have a video on that as well. Okay, so the last thing to do here is to find our categories. So I'm going to say function find categories. Now we're going to say Prisma category find many. We're going to include the parent and we're going to include the children here. So let's console.log this. And again, I'm going to wrap this in a JSON.stringify and console.log a line so we know where the last data starts. So if we scroll up to our line here, you can see that we're including our children and our parent. So parent will be null for some. And if we scroll down, the parent for others is populated, but the children isn't. In theory, you can go infinitely deep just using this basic relationship here. So a category, for example, that has children, this one here could have its own children. So that is how to model, insert, and query the most common relationships in Prisma. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a thumbs up. Let me know in the description below what projects you're working on that use Prisma. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.